Munich, January 1944. A Wehrmacht supply sergeant walks his nightly rounds through a massive ammunition depot. Rows of artillery shells stretch into the darkness. Crates of rifle ammunition stack 20 feet high. Everything appears normal. He doesn't notice the small, innocent-looking thermos flask tucked behind a pallet of mortar rounds. He certainly doesn't hear the slow chemical reaction beginning inside it. 3 hours later, the entire facility erupts. Not an explosion, something far more insidious. Flames burst from a dozen locations simultaneously, each fire impossibly hot, impossibly persistent. Water makes them worse. Sand does nothing. The Germans watched helplessly as months of munitions cook off in a hellish cascade of secondary explosions that lights up the Bavarian sky for miles. The Gestapo investigates for weeks. They find no saboteurs, no planted charges, no obvious evidence of Allied interference. Just those strange metal containers, now melted into slag. The Germans began calling them Hexenfeuer, witchfire. The British had a simpler name, thermite incendiaries. But these weren't ordinary firebombs. These were time-delayed, disguised, and absolutely devastating weapons that turned Nazi supply chains into funeral pyres. And the most terrifying part? The Germans never saw them coming. By 1941, Britain stood alone against Nazi-occupied Europe. Winston Churchill's directive to the newly formed Special Operations Executive was brutally simple: set Europe ablaze. But how do you ignite a continent across the English Channel? You can't bomb every German warehouse, every fuel depot, every ammunition dump. The Luftwaffe tried that approach on Britain and failed. The SOE needed something subtler, something an agent could carry in a suitcase, something that could sit undetected for hours or even days before unleashing hell. The problem wasn't just starting fires. Any fool with matches could do that. The challenge was creating fires that couldn't be stopped, fires that would consume military targets so completely that German logistics would collapse. And critically, fires that gave the saboteur time to escape before the flames even started. Traditional incendiaries were immediate and obvious. The SOE needed delayed action devices that could be smuggled, placed, and triggered by time rather than fuse. Enter Station 9, the SOE's secret research facility hidden in the Hertfordshire countryside. Here, Britain's most creative minds worked on what Churchill called ungentlemanly warfare. Among their deadliest creations was a device so effective, so feared by the Germans, that its very existence became psychological warfare. It looked like everyday objects. It could wait patiently for the perfect moment. And when it activated, it generated temperatures exceeding 2,400 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel, ignite ammunition, and turn concrete into lava. But what makes thermite so uniquely terrifying as a weapon, and how did the British transform basic chemistry into one of the most destructive sabotage tools of World War II? Thermite isn't explosive. That's precisely what made it perfect. An explosion announces itself, a loud bang that brings guards running. Thermite whispers before it screams. The reaction is simple chemistry, aluminum powder mixed with iron oxide. When ignited, the aluminum strips oxygen from the iron oxide in an exothermic reaction that reaches temperatures hotter than molten lava. There's no pressure wave, no dramatic detonation, just white-hot metal burning through absolutely everything. The Germans knew about thermite. They'd used it themselves in incendiary bombs dropped on British cities. But the British refined it into something far more insidious. Station 9 engineers started with the basic thermite formula, but added magnesium to increase the burn temperature and create an even more intense, persistent flame. They experimented with different ratios, testing which combinations would burn longest, hottest, and most resistant to countermeasures. The real genius wasn't the thermite itself. It was the delivery system. The SOE developed multiple disguises. Some devices were hidden inside seemingly innocuous thermos flasks, complete with fake coffee-stained interiors. Others were concealed in food tins, wooden blocks, even lumps of coal, realistic enough to fool German workers shoveling fuel into locomotive fireboxes. Imagine a German guard inspecting a shipment, holding a bomb in his hands and waving it through because it looked exactly like a piece of coal. The time delay mechanism was equally brilliant. Early versions used acid-based time pencils, glass vials of copper chloride that slowly ate through a metal wire. When the wire snapped, it released a spring-loaded striker that ignited the thermite. The delay could be calibrated from 30 minutes to 24 hours, depending on the acid concentration and wire thickness. Later models incorporated mechanical clockwork mechanisms for even greater precision. But here's what made these devices truly diabolical. Once thermite starts burning, it's nearly impossible to stop. Water doesn't extinguish it. The reaction actually breaks down water molecules, releasing hydrogen that feeds the flames. Sand and foam are equally useless. The thermite burns through them like they're not even there. Carbon dioxide can sometimes smother smaller thermite fires, but the SOE's devices contained enough material to burn through most firefighting attempts. The only real defense was catching the device before it ignited. The engineers at Station 9 tested these incendiaries on everything: steel plates, concrete blocks, engine blocks, ammunition crates. Every test produced the same result: complete destruction. A single device weighing less than 2 pounds could melt through a locomotive engine or set fire to an entire warehouse of supplies. The cost-to-damage ratio was astronomical. You won't believe how these simple devices, each costing just a few pounds to manufacture, would go on to destroy millions of pounds worth of German military equipment and completely reshape Nazi security protocols across occupied Europe. Manufacturing these devices required absolute secrecy. Station 9 produced thousands of thermite incendiaries throughout World War II, but the work was distributed across multiple facilities to prevent any single location from understanding the complete picture. One factory might produce the thermite mixture, another manufactured the timing mechanisms, a third created the disguised containers. Only at final assembly did the components come together. The thermite itself was relatively simple to produce. Britain had access to aluminum and iron oxide in abundance, but quality control was critical. Too much aluminum and the mixture burned too fast. Too much iron oxide and it might not sustain combustion. Each batch was tested rigorously before approval for field use. The timing mechanisms required precision engineering. A device that activated too early could kill the agent placing it. One that activated too late might be discovered during routine security sweeps. Production ramped up significantly after early successes in occupied France. By 1943, Station 9 was manufacturing over 500 thermite incendiaries per month in various configurations. Some were small enough to fit in a coat pocket. Others were larger units designed for maximum destruction of fuel depots or ammunition stores. The SOE even developed specialized variants for specific targets: railway thermite designed to weld train wheels to tracks, and armor-piercing versions that could burn through tank hulls. Security classifications were extreme. The devices were never referred to by descriptive names in official communications, only code designations that revealed nothing about their function. Type 74 might be a coal-disguised incendiary. Package J could be a thermos flask variant. Even within the SOE, only operatives with specific need-to-know clearance understood what they were handling. The distribution network was equally clandestine. Devices were delivered to agents in occupied Europe through night parachute drops, submarine landings, or hidden in diplomatic pouches to neutral countries like Sweden or Switzerland. Each unit came with a small instruction card written in invisible ink explaining the delay time and optimal placement. Once memorized, agents were instructed to destroy the cards. Training was thorough but necessarily brief. Agents learned how to activate the timing mechanism, where to place devices for maximum effect, and how to disguise them further using local materials. They practiced until the process became automatic. In the field, there might be only seconds to place a device while guards were distracted or during a brief moment of access to a restricted area. But theoretical capability meant nothing without operational validation. How did these cursed incendiaries perform when agents actually deployed them against real Nazi targets? The first major success came in occupied France, autumn 1942. A French resistance cell received 6 thermite devices disguised as wine bottles. Their target? A German ammunition depot outside Lyon, storing shells for the Eastern Front. The saboteurs posed as local wine merchants making a delivery to a nearby cafe. They planted the devices among the ammunition stacks during a shift change when guards were distracted. The timing mechanisms were set for 8 hours. By the time the thermite ignited, the saboteurs were 60 miles away. The resulting fire destroyed over 300 tons of artillery ammunition and killed 17 German soldiers attempting to fight the flames. The Gestapo investigation found no traces of conventional explosives. No Allied aircraft had been spotted. The Germans couldn't understand how the fire started simultaneously in multiple locations. Rumors spread among occupation forces. The British had developed a weapon that could start fires by magic. In Norway, resistance fighters used coal-disguised thermite to sabotage German locomotives. The devices would be slipped into coal bunkers by railway workers sympathetic to the Allied cause. Hours later, when the coal was shoveled into the firebox, the thermite would ignite at extreme temperature, melting the boiler and rendering the locomotive permanently disabled. Between 1943 and 1944, over 40 German locomotives were destroyed this way. The Germans never identified the cause. They assumed it was faulty coal quality from Norwegian mines. Denmark saw perhaps the most audacious use. In March 1944, SOE agents targeted the Burmeister and Wain shipyard in Copenhagen, where the Germans were building U-boat components. A team of Danish resistance fighters smuggled 15 thermite devices into the facility over 3 weeks, hiding them in tool lockers, beneath workbenches, and inside steel drums. All were set to activate simultaneously at 2 a.m. when the facility would be nearly empty. The result was catastrophic for the Germans. The thermite devices ignited precision machinery, melted irreplaceable tools, and set fire to months of accumulated materials. The heat was so intense that steel girders in the roof structure bent and collapsed. Damage estimates exceeded 2 million Reichsmarks. U-boat production from that facility was delayed by 7 months. And once again, the Germans found no evidence of conventional sabotage, just those mysterious metal containers melted into puddles of slag. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. German soldiers and occupation officials became paranoid. Every thermos flask was suspect. Every piece of coal could be a bomb. Random searches became more frequent and more aggressive, which only increased resentment among occupied populations. The Germans never realized their security measures were pointless. The devices were designed to pass any visual inspection. In Belgium, resistance networks used thermite incendiaries against fuel storage facilities. One operation in Antwerp destroyed over 50,000 gallons of aviation fuel intended for Luftwaffe squadrons. The fire burned for 3 days, despite German firefighting efforts. Investigators found thermite residue, but couldn't determine how the devices had been introduced into the heavily guarded facility. Security logs showed no unauthorized access. The mystery deepened German paranoia. Little did the Germans know, their attempts to understand and counter these cursed devices would lead them down a path of increasingly desperate and ultimately futile security measures. The German response evolved as the thermite attacks multiplied. Initial investigations assumed Allied bombing raids or conventional sabotage, but the pattern didn't match. The fires appeared without warning. They burned with impossible intensity, and they consistently targeted the most valuable, most heavily guarded facilities. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, began to suspect something new was at play. By mid-1943, the Germans had recovered enough device fragments to understand they were facing thermite-based incendiaries with time delay mechanisms. Directives went out to all occupation forces. Increase random searches, install additional guards at supply depots, and treat any unfamiliar objects as potential sabotage devices. Security protocols became draconian. Workers entering sensitive facilities faced multiple inspections. Personal items were forbidden in many locations. But the countermeasures were largely ineffective. The disguises were too good. A thermos flask looked exactly like a thermos flask. A lump of coal was indistinguishable from any other lump of coal. The Germans couldn't search everything, everywhere, all the time. And even when they found suspicious objects, they often didn't recognize them as threats until they were already burning. The SS implemented a brutal policy. Any facility that suffered a thermite attack would see its entire security staff arrested and interrogated. Dozens of innocent German guards were imprisoned or executed because the Gestapo refused to believe sophisticated sabotage could occur without inside help. This only increased paranoia and destroyed morale among occupation forces. Some German engineers proposed developing thermite detection equipment, but the technology didn't exist. You can't detect a chemical mixture that's inert until ignited. Others suggested flooding potential target areas with carbon dioxide as a preventive measure, but the cost and logistics made it impractical. The Germans were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't catch, and couldn't defend against. The propaganda war intensified. German newspapers published warnings about British terror weapons designed to murder innocent workers. They promised harsh reprisals against anyone caught with incendiary devices. But the threats were empty. The SOE's operational security was too tight. Very few agents were ever captured with the devices, and those who were had often already activated them, rendering the evidence molten slag. German security manuals from late 1943 and 1944 show increasing desperation. They describe elaborate inspection procedures for coal shipments, protocols for X-raying suspicious containers, and requirements for chemical testing of materials entering sensitive facilities. None of these measures proved effective against Station 9's sophisticated disguises and placement techniques. The paranoia created by thermite attacks had strategic effects beyond the physical damage. German commanders diverted resources to security that could have been used operationally. Production schedules were disrupted by constant inspections. Worker productivity declined as fear and suspicion poisoned facility atmospheres. The psychological burden of never knowing when the next impossible fire would erupt became its own form of warfare. Despite their effectiveness, the thermite incendiaries weren't perfect. The time delay mechanisms occasionally failed. Acid-based time pencils were sensitive to temperature. Extreme cold could slow the acid reaction, while heat accelerated it. Agents operating in Norway during winter months sometimes found their devices activated hours later than planned. In North Africa's desert heat, the opposite problem occurred. Devices ignited too early. Station 9 engineers continuously refined the designs. They developed temperature-compensated timing mechanisms that maintained accuracy across a wider range of conditions. They experimented with different ignition systems, chemical, mechanical, even electrical versions powered by primitive batteries. Each generation became more reliable, more precise, and more difficult to detect. Size was another limitation. Larger devices carried more thermite and caused more damage, but were harder to conceal and transport. The SOE eventually standardized on 3 sizes: pocket devices for opportunistic sabotage, medium units for targeted attacks, and large devices for maximum destruction operations. Agents could select the appropriate tool for each mission. The thermite formula itself evolved. Early versions burned intensely but relatively quickly, 60 to 90 seconds of sustained reaction. Later variants incorporated additives that extended burn time to several minutes, allowing the thermite to penetrate deeper into targets. Some specialized versions included steel-penetrating caps that focused the thermal energy into a narrow point, capable of burning through armor plate or vault doors. Perhaps the most significant evolution was the development of secondary effects. engineers realized that thermite could serve as an ignition source for conventional explosives planted nearby. A thermite device would activate first, drawing firefighters and security personnel, then trigger a larger explosion that maximized casualties and chaos. These combination attacks were particularly devastating in ammunition depots, where the thermite would ignite stored munitions directly. The British also developed anti-personnel variants, though these were rarely used due to ethical concerns within the SOE. These devices scattered burning thermite fragments over a wide area, creating multiple fire sources that were nearly impossible to extinguish simultaneously. Churchill himself reportedly vetoed widespread deployment of these weapons, considering them too indiscriminate for legitimate military targets. By the end of World War II, British thermite incendiaries had destroyed an estimated £400 million worth of German military equipment and supplies. Hundreds of locomotives disabled, dozens of ammunition depots obliterated, fuel reserves incinerated, factory equipment melted into useless scrap. The cumulative impact on German logistics was impossible to quantify precisely, but military historians agree these small, unassuming devices punched far above their weight. The psychological toll may have been even greater. German occupation forces lived in constant fear of invisible saboteurs with weapons that struck like curses from hell itself. The paranoia diverted resources, damaged morale, and created friction between German military authorities and civilian populations who resented the increasingly aggressive security measures. After the war, the technology didn't disappear. Intelligence services around the world studied the British thermite incendiaries and developed their own variants. The basic principles remain relevant today. Delayed action devices that can bypass security through concealment remain one of the most effective sabotage tools available. Modern versions use electronic timers and more sophisticated disguises, but the core concept traces directly back to Station 9's innovations. The devices also influenced post-war industrial safety standards. The realization that thermite reactions could start unexpectedly from seemingly innocuous materials led to new protocols for handling aluminum dust and iron oxide in manufacturing facilities. What was once a weapon became a cautionary tale about chemical hazards. For the men and women of the SOE who risked their lives planting these devices behind enemy lines, recognition came slowly. Most operations remained classified for decades. Many agents never knew how successful their missions had been. They planted the devices and escaped, never witnessing the destruction they caused. Some died before learning that their courage had contributed to Allied victory. The thermite incendiary stands as testament to British ingenuity in the darkest hours of World War II. When conventional weapons couldn't reach the enemy, when invasion was impossible and defeat seemed inevitable, Britain's scientists and spies created weapons from chemistry and cunning. They turned everyday objects into instruments of destruction. They gave hope to resistance fighters across occupied Europe, and they proved that sometimes the most devastating weapons don't announce themselves with explosions. They whisper in thermite fire hot enough to melt steel and burn through Nazi ambitions. The British thermite incendiary was never glamorous. It didn't have the dramatic appeal of the Spitfire or the technological sophistication of Enigma code breaking, but device by device, fire by fire, it helped bring down the Third Reich's industrial war machine. German soldiers called it cursed. Resistance fighters called it salvation. History should remember it as one of World War II's most effective sabotage weapons, proof that in total war, the most dangerous weapons aren't always the loudest. The next time you see a thermos flask or a lump of coal, remember, in the hands of determined saboteurs fighting tyranny, even the most ordinary objects can become extraordinary weapons. That's the true legacy of Station 9's cursed incendiary, the reminder that ingenuity, courage, and chemistry can change the course of history. Don't miss our previous videos on the forged identity cards that fooled the Gestapo, the camouflage nets that made commandos invisible, and the poison rings agents used as a last resort. Subscribe to World War II Weapons now to discover more secret innovations that helped defeat the Third Reich. Hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next.